right, so we're working through some of the great stories of the Old Testament, and today I selected, or kind of was selected by this program, this kind of group, this thing I'm working through. It's actually an old Sunday school curriculum. David and Goliath. Where would the Old Testament be without David and Goliath? And it's such a great story, and a story that, of course, we all know so well. But I just want to read a small passage from the battle. We remember that Saul and the armies of Israel were encamped across from the Philistines and Goliath would come out every day and say, hey, let's not kill everyone, let's just have this man-to-man, and let's get this over with, just you versus me. He's 9 feet some foot tall, and he's got a huge spear and a huge sword, and he's well-armored, and all the Israelites are terrified of him, and Saul's really stuck. Saul really feels like he doesn't know what to do. So David comes from his father Jesse, and his 3 brothers are at the war and in the army, and he brings cheese and goods to his brothers and to King Saul. And when David comes, he hears what Goliath says, and he sees all the men of Israel doing nothing. They're just afraid, and he gets upset because he's kind of brave and bravado and, quite frankly, a bit arrogant. And he talks about wanting to fight Goliath himself, and Saul hears it, and Saul agrees and sends him to do battle. The Bible's a little confusing. You actually have several stories of David and Saul kind of combined. They're interlaced. And here in kind of the Goliath story is the first time Saul meets David, but in fact, if you went a little before, David's already been playing the lyre for Saul and singing for Saul to kind of give peace to his restless spirit. So it's kind of a confusing story on some level, but David goes out and he tries on Saul's armor, and he's like, this won't work for me. And he goes and takes a stone right in his sling, and he goes and does battle. When the Philistine drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag. He took out a stone, he slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grasped his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him. Then he cut his head off. Lovely children's story, right? That along with Noah's Ark, just the best stories we could tell our children. All right, so when David is anointed by Samuel as king in chapter 16 or 17 or so, Samuel's in grief because he loved Saul, but God's Spirit has been removed from Saul, all right, and has been moved to someone else, to David. So Samuel sends him to Jesse, and Jesse pulls out his sons, 7 or 6, we don't actually know, and they're all good-looking, strong, strapping young men. And it's from the oldest to the next to youngest, and God keeps saying, nope, this isn't the one, nope, this isn't the one, nope, this isn't the one. And Samuel looks at Jesse and says, well, do you have any more kids? And Jesse's like, yeah, just my youngest, he's with the sheep, surely not him. And Samuel's like, bring him to me. And when he sees him, he's just a young boy, he's just a young lad. And God says, don't look at his appearances, look at his heart. Look at his heart. Surely David's got a heart that is completely devoted to God. It's a heart in complete devotion to God. He completely trusts God. And we see this when David comes to do battle with Goliath. He comes to the battle line and he hears it, and he has nothing. His overcoming the Philistine Goliath is similar to so many other great biblical stories in the Old Testament where the little thing, the small thing overcomes the big momentous thing. All David has is his trust for God. In fact, he believes in God so thoroughly, he's pretty well disgusted with all the men of Israel. He's pretty well disgusted by them, and he lets his disgust be known. They're all cowards. David's a braggart. In fact, he kind of bothers me in this story. He's a religious zealot. I mean, he's really mad in his faith, and he's not afraid of anything. He is certain that God is completely with him, and he will defeat Goliath. But here's my question. What happened if he had lost? I like to play around with the Bible. Don't ever be afraid to play around with the Bible. What happened if David had lost? His brothers had tried to send him home. The men of Israel must have looked upon him like, who is this crazy, foolish, stupid child? Saul, quite frankly, I think Saul's already getting threatened by David and is trying to get rid of him. I mean, why else would you send a 13-year-old, we don't know how old he is, out to do battle with some crazed 9-foot man? What if he had lost? What if when he was running towards the Philistine and the Philistine running toward him, he tripped? Or his sling got stuck on his garment, or he just missed. And instead of him beating Goliath, Goliath's spear skewered him to the ground. I can use that kind of language because it's biblical. Skewered is a good biblical word. What would the people have thought? What would his brothers have thought? We tried to warn him. We tried to tell him, is he so stupid, so foolish? Does he actually think life works this way? What would the Israelites think? What would all the men on the battlefield think? We knew this was foolish. We knew there's no way we could beat these Philistines. God doesn't work that way. God doesn't work that way. God doesn't work through me. What would Saul think? I want you to imagine being on that sideline and seeing this braggadocious, arrogant religious zealot who believes so firmly in God and God's God on his side, and then he gets completely demolished. You'd probably feel a mixture of two things, like, and I told you so. I think you might be feeling a little bit what the disciples might have been feeling when Jesus died. What did they feel like when Jesus, and there's never been anyone like Jesus before, died? When Jesus in John chapter 9 maybe is walking along and the disciples see a blind man on the side of the road, they go, who made that? Why is that man blind? Their theological question. Why do bad things happen to people? Why is that man blind? Is it because he sinned or his parents? He's been blind since birth. Is he bad or is his parents bad? And Jesus says, neither. Neither. He's blind so that you can see God working, that you can see the power of God today. And after he's healed, the Pharisees bring him, the religious authorities bring him to him as they investigate. They want to know how this man that was blind from birth, and they say, is this really the man? And his parents say, yeah, that's really our son. He really has been blind from birth. They go, man, how have you able to see? And the man goes, I don't know. There's this Jesus character. I don't know who he is, but I was blind before he touched me, and then I wasn't blind after he touched me. And they were like, well, who do you think he is? He goes, I don't know who he is. And they go, well, he must be a fraud. He must be a hoaxer. He must be a joker because we believe in Moses and Moses' teaching. And the blind man says, now wait a minute. I was blind since birth, and now I can see because this man touched me, and that is an act of God, which means this man must be from God. There has never been anything like this before. That's what he says. There's never been anything like Jesus before. There's never been anyone who trusts God as much as Jesus and who God seems to favor as much as Jesus. And yet, he gets skewered by the cross. What must have they been feeling? What fools we are. How can we believe that God cares? How do we trust God? What happens if someone like Jesus could trust God even more than David trusts God and die? How can we trust God? See, in the biblical way of life, and quite frankly, in our way of life, trust leads to success when we think about the Bible. We're constantly stuck in this notion, and I think it's part of who we are. Doesn't trust mean success? In the Bible, there's a couple good, it speaks about trust all the time, but here's just two good scriptures. One from Joshua. Joshua is the young man who takes over after Moses. All right, so he is actually the leader of the Israelites as they conquer Canaan. God says to Joshua, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. That could be the motto. That could be David's motto. If David had read that somewhere about his great ancestor Joshua, that could have been his motto. In Psalm 37, a great example of the Psalms. Psalms are often like, woe is me, everyone's trying to kill me. But God, you are watching, and you know that I'm good, and I'm righteous, and they're wicked, and I believe you'll protect me. Psalm 37, 4 through 6. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your justice as the new day. Trust in the Lord, and God will act. Our Bible expresses this theme again and again. You will not be let down. If you trust in God, truly have faith in God's goodness, truly trust in his way, and bring your way in alignment with his way. All right? Bring your will in alignment with God's will. You are righteous. You are righteous. You are righteous. If you have your will and God's will in alignment, your trust and your faith will lead to success. This is what drives David. See, David actually does not have blind trust, and rarely does the Bible ask for blind trust. Blind trust is that I have never been in this situation before, I have never experienced this before, but yet I'm going to go forward anyways. David actually comes to Saul and he goes, I know I can beat Goliath. I know the Lord's with me because I fought worse beasts than Goliath. When I'm watching my sheep in the field and the lions come and the bears come, I defeat them and they're scarier than Goliath is. He has experienced power and the power of God in his life to overcome scary things. He has experiential trust. Gideon, who we looked at a couple weeks ago, one of the great judges, right? Gideon, God comes to Gideon and says, I want you to lead the armies against our enemies. And Gideon's like, I'm not going to do that. And Gideon tests God, says, do this, and God does. And then again and again in the story, God gives Gideon signs of how God is with Gideon. Gideon doesn't have blind trust when he confronts the Lord's enemies with 300 men. He has experienced trust. He's a rational trust. And this is what drives David. This is what makes him who he is. And we have experienced trust, haven't we? We have experienced God's goodness in our lives. Think back in your life. Where have you experienced God's amazing activity, God's amazing providence in your life? You should, as followers of Jesus, be able to go back and say, I experienced God's providence. I experienced God's grace. I experienced God's mercy. I experienced God's blessing. Own them. Claim them. I just missed that car. My child just did that. I just got that paycheck at the last minute. Someone came through for me right when I needed it. You have experienced trust in God. And so you are here, and you are faithful, and you try things, and you serve, knowing that God has been with you in the past. But that is not the only story. You have experienced the distrust of God. You also have experienced the absence of God. You have prayed for family and friends who did not die at the right time. You have known children who have suffered in ways that they should never have suffered. You have not gotten the job. You did not get the call. You have lost friends. Your boss, those who in power, have done wicked things, and your goodness has not overcome. You have experienced things that have happened even though you have trusted and people around you have trusted. That's the honest reality of our life. We have experienced God's goodness in our trust, and we have experienced God's absence when we did trust. I think of Peter and Dorcas in the book of Acts. Dorcas, also one of the names of the women on Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, one of the great musicals of all time, if you haven't seen it lately. Dorcas dies, and she's a fantastic servant of God. And Peter is brought to their community, and they gather in a room, and the women around Dorcas show Peter all of the amazing things this servant of God has done. Why? Why has she died? Why did this happen to this woman who is so good? We trusted. This isn't the way it's supposed to work. And then Peter does something amazing. He resuscitates through a miracle the woman Dorcas. She is brought back to life, which is a great celebration of trust. Oh, we did trust, and it's amazing. But it begs the question, what about the millions of Dorcases who are not brought back to life. We should be able to lift up both questions. Amazing times when God has done an incredible thing, and the innumerable number of times God has done nothing. I think of Lazarus and his sisters and Jesus and John. Lazarus' sisters, or one of them, goes out to meet Jesus and she's weeping. Why weren't you here? Don't you love Lazarus? Didn't you love him? I have seen you heal strangers. I was certain, could you imagine what she was thinking? I was certain you would be here to heal the one you love. And Jesus knew Lazarus was dying. Jesus knew Lazarus was sick, but he waited. He waited. And even though he calls Lazarus from the tomb, he weeps at their pain, because sometimes God's absence hurts, but it's part of God's plan. I think of the blind man we already mentioned. Why is this man blind? Because of his sin or his parents' sin? Neither. His life, his blindness is in order to serve God's plan, if you but trust. He is blind so that the power of God can be revealed. He's kind of like a stone in God's hand. I don't want to say that we are playthings of God, but we are kind of like stones in God's hand. We're kind of like a stone in God's hand, and it's God's decision how to place us. You know, when David goes out and he picks up the stone, that's just a lifeless thing. It's a dead thing, if you will. It has no will of its own. That stone has no will of its own. It is through the one who holds it that gives it will. Just as David picks up a stone, God picks up David. Just as that stone needs direction applied by David, David is given direction by God. God sends David rushing towards the Philistine, just as David sends that stone rushing towards Goliath. David is as much a stone in God's hand as the stone was in David's hand. Jesus is a stone in God's hand. Jesus has given himself over completely to the will of God. I am in your hand. When Isaiah utters those famous words, "Here I am, Lord." I'm going to say it's Isaiah 6. God says, I need someone to go speak to the Israelites because they're stupid. And Isaiah says, here I am, Lord, send me. And then God says something to Isaiah. He goes, you're basically going to fail. I'm sending you a prophet to speak my words, and my words are supposed to open people's eyes, unstop their ears, unleash their song, change their lives, make people more faithful, and no one's going to pay any attention to you. You're going to fail. God sends Isaiah, even though Isaiah is doing God's will, even though he is going to fail. Isaiah simply says, I am a stone in your hand. You direct me. You place me. Whether I fail by my understanding or succeed by my understanding. Whether I draw large crowds and transform the whole population with my words, your words, or whether it falls on deaf and dumb ears, that's up to you. I'm a stone in your hand. Here I am. And that's what Jesus did. Use me. Place me. Do what you need with me. And it's a lesson that the apostles learned. Peter and the other 11. Tradition tells us we're all martyred. By most of our standards, that is not success. That is not what it means to trust God. How many people prayed for Peter to survive, for James to survive? How many often did they pray, Lord? But I think mostly what they did as they trusted God was trusted that God was using them in the way that best served God's purposes. That best served God's love. It wasn't about their will. It was about God's will. Trusting God is not equal your success or my success. It equals God's success. Trusting God is being able to put yourself in God's hands and say, use me as you need. I trust you. For David, it meant killing Goliath. For Jesus, it meant dying on the cross. I turned to Paul. What did it mean for Paul? I turned to Philippians, one of the greatest epistles and writings we have, I think, in the Bible. I turned to Paul. Surely a stone in God's hands. In Philippians, now, what I want you to know, brothers and sisters, is that this has happened to me and is actually serving to advance the gospel. See, Paul is in chains. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard who has arrested me and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Do you not imagine that Paul prayed not to be put in chains? Do you not imagine that those who loved him and cared for him prayed that he not be put in chains? But he was put in chains because ultimately Paul was a stone in God's hands. Here I am, I trust you. And then he's able to see how God is using him, sending him, directing him as best as God is able. He goes on, for to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. I don't know whether I want to live or die. If I am going on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor before me. Yet what shall I choose? I don't know. I am torn between the two, a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is by far better. But I feel it is more necessary for you that I remain here in the body, convinced of this. He becomes convinced that the way God needs to use him, the way God is going to direct him, isn't to die, which is for selfish reasons. He just wants to be with Christ. But to live, not for his gain, not for his purposes, not so he can go on eating great food and taking great photographs and having great vacations and living great memories, but so that others might benefit. But he believes so firmly that God wants others to benefit that he will somehow miraculously be spared the death he is being taken to. He is a stone in God's hand. He is just there waiting to be placed. But I think he has a doubt because the next verse, whatever happens. However, if I am wrong, and Paul has been wrong before, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you, without being frightened in any way. Whether I live or die, don't be afraid. Whether you are arrested or are free, don't be afraid. Whether you are being brought to trial or not, don't be afraid. Trust that God has you in his hand. Trust. And your trust will be a sign. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed and that you will be saved by God. Whatever happens in our lives, we are to surrender to the trust we have in God. My friends, that is not an easy thing to do. That is not an easy thing to do. And it does not mean that because you prayed and because you are righteous and because you are good and because you go to church and because you tithe and because you give and because you're awesome, that you're going to have a great life. It simply means that you trust God to use you in the way that is best to witness to the glory and power and awesome grace of God's love. That is the witness of Jesus Christ and of all those who followed him, and what we strive to find in our own hearts. Listen to a word from God to you this morning.